10 years ago, we were more bothered by full frame versus Super 35, 4K versus 1080. But after this camera came along, something changed. Suddenly, we became obsessed with seeing in the dark. I bought this camera probably over 10 years ago now. It was probably the first time I fell victim to gear acquisition syndrome, and that was mainly due to this chap. We'll hear more from Sir Bloom later on, but when I first got this camera, I was going to shoot a music video for a friend's band. Already had a GH4, but decided this video needed to be shot on a full frame camera, and the A7s came knocking. It was a tiny full frame mirrorless camera that could literally see in the dark. I needed it. And honestly, in the long run, I have no regrets. I used this camera for loads of professional work, and it even interestingly ignited a love for vintage lenses and stills photography. So what is this video about? Why now? Why would anyone be interested in a camera this old? Well, I don't know. I guess this is part nostalgia, part looking at how we got to where we are today. I think we're so obsessed with the latest tech, I think it's nice to look back occasionally. And also because I think this camera was a major influence on camera design moving forwards and what, consumers demanded. But it also just democratized filmmaking as a whole. This was a camera that now allowed people to shoot in available lights and didn't necessarily require lots of big and bulky lighting equipment. So let's go back 10, 11 years ago. The camera had some impressive specs for the time. It could capture full HD 1080p up to 60 frames a second. It recorded to the XAVC-S codec at 50 megabits per second. Not a lot by today's standards, but pretty solid for 2014. The camera had quite an interesting sensor, so it was only 12 megapixels, which even by standards back in those days was pretty low. But that was because this sensor had much larger pixels than the average sensor, and that's what gave it this sort of genre-defining light sensitivity. By today's standards, this camera is tiny. Obviously, it's a mirrorless camera, and these were relatively new back then. Most people were used to shooting on much larger, bulkier cameras like DSLRs. It was also part of the first run of Sony mirrorless cameras, the Alpha series, that featured a log profile. So these cameras featured S-Log2, which was incredibly novel for a camera of this type and size. However, whether it was actually worth shooting in S-Log on these cameras, considering they only captured an 8-bit, is up for debate, and we'll look at that a little bit later on. This was also a time where 4K was inching into consumer cameras, and this camera was technically 4K ready, just not internally like a camera like the GH4. But it could do this via an external recorder over HDMI. So all of this was a pretty big deal. What's it like to use now? Well, first things first, it feels pretty good in the hand still. It's small, understated. Camera's definitely got a bit bigger again after this. It's kind of the size of a Fuji X100V, something like that. If you've got big sausage fingers, you might struggle with it. It was definitely the smallest in the A7s lineup. I think as they upgraded the features, those cameras tended to bulk up. So with the Mark II, that included IBIS and 4K internal recording. And then with the Mark III, we had high frame rates, autofocus, and 10-bit recording. And I guess that had a cooling system as well to sort of accommodate all of that. The menu system in this camera, like all of Sony's at the time and arguably still today, terrible. You get used to it eventually, sort of, not really ever at all. I definitely took me a lot of frustrating times to find certain features when I came back to this recently. It doesn't have a touchscreen. It has a sort of flippy articulating monitor, which is fine. It's got quite a nice EVF. Battery life, abysmal. Blackmagic pocket cinema camera territory. Carrying 6 batteries in your bag wasn't really optional, it was required, I think. They are tiny, which I guess is a positive. It was really easy to lose them. I lost tons of the little batteries over the years. During an interview, you would definitely do at least 1 or 2 battery swaps. So over the space of a day of continuous shooting, probably going through like 6 batteries in a day, probably more if you're using cheap third-party batteries. This camera, of course, came along way before Sony developed its awesome autofocus system. So I believe this camera it used a contrast-based system. It works fine for stills, I think, I remember, and was generally okay for like one-shot focus for video. But to be honest, I was mostly shooting with manual lenses when I was using this camera.
Hello, my name is Philip Bloom and welcome to the video review of the Sony Alpha 7s.
It really was a genuinely pivotal change. It showed what digital was capable of.
This camera was released in a time where people were starting to talk about cameras online and were beginning to review them in YouTube videos. We were certainly a long way away from the camera YouTube niche that we have today, but thanks to early trailblazers like Philip Bloom, this was probably the first camera that I got where I was influenced off the back of a YouTube video.
When they announced the camera, the video that they put out with it was some fishermen in Scotland, I think, and it just didn't do what it should have done, which is sell me on the camera. It could have been filmed at 7 in the morning. It just didn't get that sense of like, it's dark right now and look what we can see. Which is why I went down to Brighton with the lone camera. This was filming down on Brighton Beach at night time. I could see on the camera what I couldn't see with my eyes. We were just laughing because we couldn't quite believe what we were seeing. I'd been shooting for, I don't know, 26 years at that point. And it was jaw-dropping.
I think it's interesting because this low light capability was something you could easily show in visual comparisons. You know, this camera could literally see in the dark and the competition couldn't, and you could point to that and you could show it very easily.
You need to see it. It really is something we hadn't seen before. That sort of thing that really just sold this technology and this camera. And it's the most viewed video on my channel. I think it sold a lot of cameras for them.
You had this generational leap in what consumers could get out of a tiny, affordable digital camera. And ever since, cameras have had to stack up against the seemingly impossible standard.
So I think the A7s definitely started this obsession with how good a camera is in low light. Everything was compared to it. These days, we kind of just assume all cameras are good in low light. I don't expect it to still be A7S III levels, but most cameras are very good, you know, with dual base ISO.
You know, as soon as people see on social media that I'm testing a new camera, the first questions that come through are, how is it in low light? Is it better than this camera with low light? Is it better than the FX3 in low light? Whole sections of camera reviews are dedicated to low light performance, and cameras now often live and die on this basis alone. With the Sony A7s, the genie was well and truly out of the bottle. So how does the image stack up today? Well, you know, it's not awful, but it's not great, obviously by today's standards. As I was going back to capture footage of this thing, I was kind of just reminded that just how little latitude 8-bit footage really has, and just how much of a game changer, you know, having 10-bit recording is. You really have to nail your exposure and your white balance. And if you want to get juicy in the grade, you'll run up against, you know, issues like banding and noise. And you really don't have much leeway to push stuff around. I remember absolutely loving the image out of this thing. And it was the camera that got me into grading. You know, the camera came with a lot of picture profiles, obviously the most infamous being S-Log 2.
Having log is a great freedom when shooting, better dynamic range, great for getting it right in post, but it needs a strong codec, 10-bit, and it didn't have 10-bit, it's an 8-bit camera. Took until 2020 for the A7S line, for Sony mirrorless cameras, to get 10-bit, so I didn't touch it, not until then.
I did experiment with this a lot. The only issue is that its minimum ISO is 3200, which was a bit of a nuisance back then, as there wasn't really like an overabundance of good and cheap variable NDs. But you know, experimenting with S-Log 2 was what got me experimenting more with color grading and introduced me to using LUTs for the first time in my workflow. But there were alternative picture profiles. You had stuff like Cine 2, I think, and Cine 4. And I think professionally, those were the ones I opted to shoot in for most jobs. The rolling shutter on this thing was also pretty terrible. But again, you know, 2014, we didn't quite have the same demands that we have nowadays. And people were, you know, able to make very beautiful work on this thing. And even, you know, looking back at some of the work that I made, it still looks nice. You know, I didn't know what I was doing, but it still looked good.
As a documentary director of photography, having a tool that could be so freeing that I could film at smaller, smaller f-stops, so I had a bigger depth of field. But really key for me was I could film in locations and have minimal lighting. So I could film in these fantastic situations where normally you'd have to have a huge amount of lights to get anything of it. I could light it with candles, and that was just incredible for me.
I think the low light abilities of this camera were significant because they also mark this huge step in democratizing filmmaking. Back when this camera launched, we didn't really have good, affordable LED lighting solutions. So having a camera that could see in the dark suddenly meant you could shoot in more environments. You could shoot with available light. You didn't have to open up your lens as much, which made focusing easier. You didn't need expensive, power-hungry lighting systems. You didn't need to lug them with you. You didn't need lots of power to support them. You could just go out and shoot and make a film and work with what you had. And this made it very popular for people shooting docs or anywhere with uncontrolled lightings.
I'm a very spontaneous kind of shooter. I like turning up to a location and going, okay, hello, I'm going to do it straight away. I can see where the lights are, I can see where the windows are, I can see if I can use them, look outside, see if it's cloudy, see if the light's going to be continuous, see if I can use that, and then go from there. And I'm nice and fast, and I love developing stories. That's what I enjoy about filming, that sort of stuff. And a tool which can let me harness what's already there and then just add on what I wanted was great. It gave you so much more creative freedom.
And I'm pretty sure everyone who went out and got one of these cameras ended up shooting at least one project in candlelight, including myself. It felt pretty astonishing to be able to do something like that with something the size of this. The video is only half of the story, and the thing that I also weirdly loved about this camera, and the thing that probably prolonged my relationship with it over the years, was its stills capability. I paired it with old vintage lenses at the time, partly because I was broke and starting out, but mostly because, they had a lot of personality and I really got into collecting and shooting on these. Native Sony E-mount lenses were notorious at the time for being expensive. I mean, they still are, but there was less choice back then, and I'm not sure there were a huge variety of budget third-party lenses kicking about. But eventually I did stump up for one Sony E-mount lens. I think I only ever got one Sony E-mount lens, and it was this 35mm Zeiss f2.8. But I really wanted a walkabout lens that had autofocus, and the autofocus with this lens worked great, and it was just perfect for sort of quick snaps on the go. I didn't love the look of this lens after coming from vintage lenses. It was very clean, it was very sharp, but the ease of use more than made up for that. And I think this camera was just so much fun to use. It was so small, it was easy just to shove into a pocket, and especially when you had this little 35mm lens or a small vintage lens on, it was just easy to carry around. And I think until the Fuji X100V, which I only got last year, this was the only digital camera I've ever genuinely enjoyed shooting photos on. It was small enough to bring anywhere, discreet enough to not make a big deal out of itself, and it just made a nice sound when I took a photo. And I think its size was just instrumental in me just bringing this camera along with me everywhere. I took it on a 5-week long road trip across the US from New York down to New Orleans and then Seattle and then down to San Francisco, which was an incredible trip. All of these beautiful little moments that I was able to capture on this camera because I always had it on me. And I think just over the years, this camera has just stayed with me. So I've got loads of beautiful portraits of family and friends and moments captured. The A7s had a 12 megapixel sensor, so it was never going to be a huge hit with a lot of still shooters. You couldn't crop into your shots, but I think also it arrived at a time when stuff like Instagram was getting bigger, and most of my images, soon ended up on Instagram, and that kind of resolution was absolutely fine for that destination. And I think when I later upgraded to larger, bulkier mirrorless cameras like the Lumix S5, I just stopped bringing those cameras around with me all the time, and as a result I just stopped capturing as many stills, and there's just a bit of a hole in my stills archive. The A7S wasn't perfect, but combined with a little vintage 50mm and slung over my shoulder, it had soul.
I think it was unique. We got excited about the 5D Mark II's 3200 ISO. Like, wow, shooting at f1.4. And then suddenly to have something so much more sensitive with such a great looking image was something special. I just hope that Sony don't drop the A7S. It's been 5 years since we had the A7S III. I hope there will be a 4. I know the FX3 is the camera a lot of people are using. Something about the A7S line, which is wonderful. What's going to be key is if they do decide to go to say 6K, which is quite likely, surely that's going to affect the low light performance. I mean, sensor technology has improved a lot over the years, so maybe it's possible, but I don't know if they can still get that same performance out of a 6K image.
Was it the camera that ruined everything. Well, maybe, but also it did kind of make everything better. It forced the industry to sit up and pay attention and give us the tools that generally made our lives better as filmmakers. And it made it easier to shoot on the fly. And I'm sure part of my love for this camera comes down to my own nostalgia and where I was when I got this camera, but I feel like it did show us what was possible. You know, it pushed the industry forward. It gave people like me, you know, people making zero budget music videos and small scale documentaries, the ability to make something that didn't look budget. It looked like it wasn't shot on the cheap. And for that, I'll always love this little brick of magnesium alloy for its overachieving ambition, and it's probably why I'll never end up selling it. That's it, I'm Ed Prosser, thanks for watching, thanks to Philip Bloom for featuring in this video, and until next time, I'll see you later. See ya.